Now, can people hear me? Okay. Thank you all the staff from the library, and thank you all who are here in attendance. I really appreciate you coming out. I'm eager to share Hubert Harrison with you all. He is a giant of Black history, and I think you'll come to realize that as we go through the presentations. I envision this as the first of 3 presentations on Harrison and his life. And I'm going to be showing slides and talking about them. So I hope people can hang in there, and we'll do this. I think you'll find it very interesting. So Hubert Harrison lives from 1883 to 1927. He's a brilliant intellectual, writer, speaker, reviewer, and activist. He is race and class conscious. He's a radical internationalist. He is known as the father of Harlem radicalism. He is a key ideological link in the civil rights/Black liberation movement, and he will continue to grow in importance in the 21st century. I make these statements without any equivocation. I've written a 2-volume biography on Hubert Harrison. Volume 1, I think we have 1 copy left over there, is the Voice of Harlem Radicalism, 1883 to 1918, Columbia University Press. It was nominated for the Isaac Deutscher Award. The second volume, which just came out a few months ago, is the last 9 years of his life, Hubert Harrison, The Struggle for Equality, 1918 to 1927. It was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. Needless to say, I didn't win either. This 2-volume biography is based on more than 39 years of research and extensive use of the Hubert H. Harrison papers and diary, which I preserved and inventoried before placing at Columbia University's Rare Book and Manuscript Library. I got those papers from his family, and I'll get into that story. It is believed to be the first full-life, multi-volume biography of an Afro-Caribbean, and only the 4th of an African-American after those of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Langston Hughes. Here's a 2-volume biography. You can see some quotes there from Brent Hayes Edwards of Columbia University, Usman Power Green from Brooklyn, and teaches up in Clark University in Massachusetts. And on the next slide, you've got quotes from Arnold Rampersand of Stanford, who's the biographer of Langston Hughes, and Cornell West, Carol Boyce Davies from Cornell, and at the bottom you see a little ad from Columbia University Press. If you aren't able to get the books today, if you go to the Columbia University Press website and use the code CUP20, you can order the books at a 20% discount, which is good. We also have here a Hubert Harrison Reader, which has 138 of 700 articles he did, with introductions and notes by me. And it's now in ebook format. It came out in 2001, and only within the past few months did Wesleyan University Press put it out in ebook, so that's wonderful. We also have a book that I edited for Diasporic Africa Press. They're out of Brooklyn. And this is a new edition of Harrison's When Africa Awakes. And the subtitle is very important: The Inside Story of the Stirrings and Strivings of the New Negro in the Western World. And I point out it's important because this book was written in 1920, 5 years before Alain Leroy Locke writes the book, The New Negro. Okay, moving on. For more information, if you go to my website, simply my name, all kinds of free information, audios and videos. As I mentioned to a few people here, just today, before I left home, one of my recent videos on Theodore W. Allen's The Invention of the White Race which opens with 12 minutes on Hubert Harrison. It's a 2-hour video like what we're doing here, just past 281,000 views. He's really taking off, both Harrison and Allen. Brief intro on Harrison. He was born April 27, 1883, St. Croix, Virgin Islands. He was a brilliant autodidact, self-educated, working class, race and class conscious writer, orator, educator, book reviewer, political activist, and radical internationalist. The historian Joel A. Rogers, in World's Great Men of Color, this book, which has now gone through 7 reprint editions, very important book, describes him as perhaps the foremost Afro-American intellect of his time and one of America's greatest minds. Rogers added that no one worked more seriously and indefatigably to enlighten his fellow men, and none of the Afro-American leaders of his time had a saner and more effective program. The labor and civil rights activist A. Philip Randolph, referring to a period when Harlem was considered the international Negro Mecca and the center of radical black thought, described Harrison as the father of Harlem radicalism. Richard B. Moore, a major activist and bibliophile who worked with the Socialist Party, the African Blood Brotherhood, Communist Party, and movements for Caribbean independence and federation, and ran a bookstore for about 20 years on 125th Street, and before his death placed 17,000 books down at the University of West Indies in Cave Hill, Barbados. A great bibliophile like Harrison, these other people, described Harrison as above all his contemporaries in his steady emphasis that a vital aim was the liberation of the oppressed African and other colonial peoples. I just want to add also, I'm still to this day in touch with Joyce Moore Turner, who's the daughter of Richard B. Moore. She just passed 100 years old, and she recently had an article published in an academic journal, which is an amazing accomplishment, and she's my good friend, but what I like also about her is she gives it to me straight. When I want feedback from her, she brings it, you know, and you want people like that, you know, to read and comment on your stuff. Here's Joel A. Rogers, author of World's Great Men of Color. There's the quote I just cited. Harrison as an intellectual, that's what Rogers just focused on. After he comes to New York in 1900, he's working 5 days a week and 2 nights, but he goes to high school because he only went up to 8th grade in St. Croix. And one of the New York dailies, the New York World, says, "Genius found in West Indian student." They hadn't seen anybody like him. He's getting citywide honors when he's barely going to school, you know. And he, based on his papers and his diary and others, there are indications he spoke or read 6 languages, including in the last year or 2 of his life, he was teaching himself Arabic and reading the Quran because it was a religion of so many people of African descent. Although he himself was a free thinker, but he was very much tied into the community he tried to reach. He read voraciously. By one account, he read several books a day, but I've been through his books and his papers, and I think he knew how to attack books. So you can see he could see, look at the table of contents, look at the index, look at the, you know, various pages, maybe mark up some, and he know how to focus on what was important to himself. But the librarian, Ernestine Rose, at the Schomburg, what became the Schomburg Center, the 135th Street Public Library, said while Harrison was alive, there was no one who borrowed or read more books from the library than Hubert Harrison. He was, as an orator, he was a pioneering soapbox orator, and a real pioneering, and we'll get into some of the specifics later on, but he would speak on history, science, politics, religion, education, literature, theater, evolution, and race and class, wide-ranging. And as an intellectual, last year, Columbia, when I placed the papers with Columbia, I tried to preserve all his papers, which were turned over to me by his family, and they entrusted them to me back in the early, around 1990. And I was overwhelmed that they entrusted me, the papers to me, and I became an archivist overnight. And I preserved them, put them in Mylar and acid-free paper. And after I went around with this grandson, we finally settled on Columbia University as the home for the papers, because the family felt most comfortable at that time with Columbia because they had the resources to process them. And we placed Harrison's papers at Columbia, although I've got a lot more since then. And we also made it, part of the agreement was that they would digitize, they would put Harrison's papers up online. And only last year did they finally come through, and there are now over 1,300 items from Harrison's papers online for free, including his diary, which is an extraordinary document, and it takes up over 200 pages. And that was given to me by his daughter after I had written most of my first volume and stuff. We went out to B. Smith restaurant to celebrate. I was getting close to my doctorate. So I went on a little splurge, and I took her out to dinner. She was 75. She reached in her bag, and she goes, "Here, Jeff." And I go, "What's that?" And she goes, "Take a look." And it was his diary. I was blown away, you know. And I would come home at night and transcribe it every day. But that's up online. You'll find it a fascinating read. He's very legible, his writing. And so it really is very revealing. Excerpts of it can be found in the Hubert Harrison Reader and in both volumes, because I quote from it extensively. His two books are The Negro and the Nation, written in 1917, and When Africa Awakes, which I mentioned before, written in 1920. Negro and the Nation had about 18 of his articles, I think. When Africa Awakes had 53 of his articles, and that was written in 1920. But there's so much more, because I've accumulated, I think the total was 173 articles that he wrote, or something like that. As a journalist, he was editor of The Masses in 1911. That's the leading left literary publication in the U.S. He edits The Voice in 1917 to 1919, the first newspaper of the militant New Negro movement. He's the founder of this New Negro movement, 1917, 8 years before Alain Locke and the New Negro, 1925. He edits a publication called The New Negro in 1919. All this is he's doing in Harlem. And the New Negro was, on his logo up top, he writes, intended as an organ of the international consciousness of the darker races, especially of the Negro race. He is the principal editor from 1920 to 1922 of Marcus Garvey's Negro World. And in his last years, he edits his final publication, The Voice of the Negro, and for his organization called the International Colored Unity League. And in that, he's a little bit like Malcolm in his last years when he has the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Harrison's trying to pull things together a little more. And in between, particularly between 22 and 27, he is writing prolifically and speaking prolifically. And we'll get into that probably in the second and third lectures. As a critic, he's an extraordinary critic, literary critic. Eugene O'Neill wins a Nobel Prize for Literature, and he writes that Harrison's review of The Emperor Jones is the finest he's ever seen, and Harrison has a role to play in any theater, you know, that O'Neill does. He was the first regular book reviewer. His quote is in Negro newspaperdom. Back when Harrison's alive, it was a major step forward to use Negro with a capital N instead of colored or other more derogatory words. And that's why Harrison's was the New Negro movement. Garvey's paper was the Negro World. It was the phrase was used with pride and with the capital N. And I've located 68 to 70 reviews by Hubert Harrison. He's a brilliant book, wide-ranging, all topics. And he's cited by the National Book Critics Executive Board members as they quote him on their homepage as how to review books. Moving on. As an activist, he is a pioneer black activist in the socialist movement, the leading black activist in the socialist movement. He's a leading black activist in the free thought movement. If people are not familiar with that, that's the movement that breaks from religion and is more independent thinking, and we'll go into that today. He was a leading black activist in the birth control movement, although he was aware of the bad uses that the birth control movement could be put, and he spoke out against that. And of course, he was the pioneer black activist of the New Negro movement. He was a promoter and aide to black writers and artists. We'll name some of them in a little bit. He was a featured lecturer for the New York City Board of Education, particularly in the 1920s, the first regular black lecturer for the New York City Board of Education. He would do evening courses at the 135th Street Library and other places, all, again, wide-ranging topics, and had wonderful attendance at these. And this is what always warms my heart, he was a bibliophile and library popularizer. He was on the founding committee in 1925 that, working with Ernestine Rose, Arthur Schomburg, and James Weldon Johnson, that set up the Division of Negro Literature, History, and Prints of the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library, which grew into the Schomburg Center. And Harrison would speak regularly at that library, even before, when it was the 135th Street Library. And he'd deliver lectures on series of lectures, and after it was established, his photo hung in the lobby at first, but now they haven't been able to locate it. It's part of all the questions of what's happened to Harrison. Why isn't he better known? Moving on. A. Philip Randolph, big follower of Harrison, called Hubert Harrison the father of Harlem radicalism. And this is a period when Harlem was considered the center of radical black thought, and Harrison deserved that title, and international Negro Mecca. That was the other phrase used with it. Harrison played unique signal roles in the largest class radical movement, socialism, and the largest race radical movement of his era. He was a major influence on the class radical Randolph and the race radical Marcus Garvey and other militant new Negroes and common people. That's a phrase he used with affection, like what we have here, right? He was of the people. And in the period around World War I, W.A. Domingo, a socialist from Jamaica and the first editor of Garvey's Negro World, explained that Garvey, like the rest of us, A. Philip Randolph, Richard B. Moore, Grace Campbell, Chandler Owen, Cyril Briggs, and other militant new Negroes followed Hubert Harrison. And the historian and Garvey expert Robert A. Hill refers to Harrison as the new Negro ideological mentor. Harrison played unique signal roles in these movements. As a class radical, he was the foremost black organizer, agitator, and theoretician in the Socialist Party around 1912 during its heyday. As a race radical, he founded the Liberty League in 1917. He edited in 1919. He edits the New Negro, and then in 1920, he's the editor of Marcus Garvey's Negro World during its radical high point when it sweeps the globe. In my books, I describe him, and I think it's accurate. Amongst his generation, he was the most class conscious of the race radicals. and the most race-conscious of the class radicals. That's an extraordinary combination. Here's Randolph again. So he's the major radical influence, on Randolph. He's the major radical influence on Marcus Garvey. Here again, he founds the Liberty League, he edits the New Negro, he writes When Africa Awakes, and Locke's book doesn't come out till 1925. Here's a cover page from Harrison's New Negro, and you can see some of the topics. This is in 1919. The women of our race, education in West Africa, the white war and the colored world, and two Negro radicalisms. Brilliant writer, he writes these very probing editorials and has a wide followership. I've mentioned this, he's the key link in the two great ideological trends. When I say he's a key link in the two great ideological trends of the civil rights, black liberation movement, I'm referring to the trends associated with Randolph and Martin Luther King, that's the civil rights trend, and the race and national trend associated with Garvey and Malcolm X. Malcolm's father was a Garveyite preacher, and his mother was a reporter for Garvey's Negro World, the newspaper for which Harrison had been a principal editor. Moving on. Key ideological link. Influence on Martin and Malcolm. He was a radical internationalist, extremely knowledgeable on Africa, Asia, the Mideast, the Americas, and Europe, and he wrote extensively on these topics. There was no contemporary even approaching him when he's alive. Richard B. Moore writes, Harrison was above all the militant black socialists in his steady emphasis on the liberation of the oppressed African and colonial peoples as a vital aim. Historian Winston James, whose book Holding Aloft the Banner of Ethiopia is about early 20th century Caribbean radicalism, writes, Harrison had confidence in and humility before the peoples of Africa. His knowledge was encyclopedic. He proudly identified with the African continuities in St. Croix and in the U.S. And for Harrison, Africa was primarily a teacher, not a primitive, unschooled child in need of civilization. And this phrase, in need of civilization, I get into in volume 1 and 2, but for those familiar with Garvey, when he sets up his Universal Negro Improvement Association, one of the objects of that organization is to civilize African peoples. And Harrison is not taking that arrogant approach. You know, he's got a different approach on that. And then for Harrison as an internationalist, he writes in the 20s, and this indicates what an internationalist he was. Although I am not satisfied with American conditions as they now are, I realize that in these days of change and unrest, I would not have been satisfied anywhere else. In China, I would be fighting against foreign domination. In Egypt, India, South Africa, or West Africa, I would be fighting against the British oligarchs. In Jamaica, against the sinister repression of black people practiced by both whites and mulattoes, and Dutch, French, or American West Indies against crackerism, stupidity, and cowardice. So he brings it all. So overall, Hubert Harrison is race conscious. He's class conscious. He's scientific. He's an internationalist. He emphasizes the common people. His approach is mass. In his day, the two main ways that you reach the masses were soapbox oratory and newspapers, and he was a master of each, right? Unrivaled in each area. He was a big proponent of direct action, and we'll get into this because this comes from his Crucian roots too. He understood the interrelationship between literature and the arts, and he drew off that and wrote about that. He was anti-capitalist anti-imperialist and scientific. And throughout all, he always challenged white supremacy because he understood it to be central to capitalist rule in the U.S. and the key, and opposition to white supremacy to be the key to social change efforts in this country. And his children always told me, when I first met his children, 2 of them were alive in the New York area, they said, always remember, he always challenged white supremacy. And please share that with your audiences. Why is Harrison not better known? Here, we'll get into a few interesting things. Let me get a little shot of water before we get into this. Won't be long. Harrison was poor. He was working class. He was black. He was very dark-skinned, as you can see in the photos. He's foreign-born. He's from the Caribbean. All these groups are underrepresented in general in black history and U.S. history. Let's get this next slide. He is a radical. This is very important. He's a radical on class, race, and religion. So a lot of the powers that be, have problems with that. He is a forthright critic. He will speak his mind openly, and we're going to get into where he develops that approach. He had no long-lasting organizational ties. We'll talk about that. He dies young at 44, but he's not martyred like Malcolm and Martin. He doesn't live long like Du Bois, and he's not martyred like Malcolm and Martin. And then this last topic, this is where I'm going to take a little liberty. It's got to do with how history is written, reviewed, and passed on. So you ready for this one? Okay. First, again, Harrison challenged leading figures in African-American left, labor, and literary areas during the course of his life. He was not mean-spirited, but he would raise objections to things they said or wrote if he thought they merited, comment on. So there's black leaders, left labor leaders, organizations. J. Rogers explains much of the enmity against Harrison was incurred by his devastating candor. He spoke out freely what he thought, and more often than not, it was with such annihilating sarcasm that those whom he attacked never forgave him. There was, however, no personal malice in Harrison's shaft. He was willing to shake hands with an opponent as soon as he descended from the platform, and was surprised and hurt that others would not do the same. Peter Dimmock. When I first started writing on Harrison, late 1880s, 1890s, I had an offer for a contract for his biography from a major university press. And when I came back to them after I had received Harrison's diary, I came back, I gave them a manuscript for volume 1, and they didn't know what to do with it. The reviews went through the roof. They send it to outside reviewers, but it was 800 pages, volume 1, manuscript. I had a second volume coming, and basically the question for them was, who is Hubert Harrison, and who are you? What are you doing? And I went back and forth with them for 15 years, and I was not going to budge, because I thought Harrison was that important. So finally, a friend of mine, Winston James, who I mentioned earlier, suggested I go speak with Peter Dimmock, who was the senior editor at Columbia University Press and had been senior editor at Random House before that. Brilliant editor. He said, Jeff, I can't formally speak with you because you're under contract. So I broke the contract, and then we go out to have a little lunch. And he says, tell me who you write about besides Harrison. What do you do? I say, well, I write about Harrison, and I write about Theodore W. Allen. He goes, Theodore W. Allen? He goes, I've known how important Allen was since he wrote that 1978 article critical of Edmund Morgan. Edmund Morgan was the president of the Organization of American Historians. and a major historian of 17th century U.S. But Allen writes a stunning critique of his, because his book is based on much more research than Morgan did. And I just lit up, because not many people know who Allen was. And I said, wow, this sounds good to me. And in the course of our conversation, he says, Jeff, let me tell you something. 95% of the historians out there have not heard of Hubert Harrison or Theodore W. Allen. And of those who have, of those 5% who have heard of them, 95% feel that their work is threatened by the work of Harrison and Allen. Please think about that, right? This is how history gets passed on in this country. You know, it's a lot of tapping your, praising your friend, promoting your friend. But if anything's going to come and challenge your work, silence it, don't promote it. And I think that's one of the most insightful comments I've seen on both Harrison and Allen. So, here comes an example. And it's an example from probably the primary gatekeeper today of black studies, Henry Louis Gates, Jr., up at Harvard. And Gates invited me up to speak at Harvard in 2010. And I spoke. And as I was speaking like this, and I showed that slide from J.A. Rogers, he interrupts me. Usually my host doesn't interrupt right away. And he goes, Jeff, you don't think J.A. Rogers, because Rogers had said Hubert Harrison is perhaps the foremost Afro-American intellect of his period. And he goes, you don't really think J.A. Rogers is a serious historian, do you? And I say, yeah, I do. And he goes, Jeff, he is a joke as a historian. And 30 seconds later, he interrupts me again. And he says, Jeff, J.A. Rogers is a joke as a historian. He sees black blood in so many European Americans, so many white Americans. Now, why that's important? First off, for those who don't believe me, it took me a couple of years to get I never was able to get the video of my presentation, but I got the audio of it, and I carry it around on my cell phone. And you can hear it later. Maybe we'll have Rob or somebody get a copy of it. And why that's interesting is a year after Gates says that stuff to me on my presentation, his publication, The Root, which is the most visited black website in the U.S., it's at root.com, starts running a series entitled 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro, which is the title of a book by J.A. Rogers. Gates doesn't do the research. He's got graduate students, all these people doing the research. But in that book, in that series, before the series starts, Gates opens up and says, I've been a great fan of J.A. Rogers since my first year in college. And I just shook my head in disbelief when I read that. And then the next year, about a year later, he starts the show that's all over TV using Ancestry.com when he's bringing people up to interview them, and they go into their DNA, and he shocks people with their African roots and stuff. So in Spanish, to me, I say sin vergüenza. He just does, he knows no shame, this guy, when he does this stuff. So that stuff stays in my mind. But then, to get more deeply into Gates and Harrison, when Gates makes his rise as an academic, he's considered an expert on the new Negro. He writes a major article in the 1980s entitled The Trope of the New Negro, 1988. In that article, 26 pages, I think, he does not mention Hubert Harrison once. Hear what I'm saying? Not once. Then he writes a book which purports to be a look at the full sweep of African American history. It's titled Life Upon These Shores. Doesn't mention Harrison once. Inconceivable to me that he would do this. Then he puts out a publication called The New Negro, Readings on Race Representation in African American Culture, which he co-edits. In it, he reprints a number of Harrison's articles, which he takes from my reader. But when he reprints them, he doesn't include acknowledgement of their sources oftentimes in the list of acknowledgements on pages 11 and 12. More than that, when he mentions Harrison briefly on page 8, he does not discuss Harrison's pioneering contributions to the New Negro movement. Then the book, Gates's book, puts Harrison article from 1920 under a 1920 heading, 2 1917 articles. In other words, Harrison loses the primacy of his articles. Harrison writes these articles in 1917. Gates lists them in 1920, and so on and so forth. Book offers no dates for another publication, and I go through. It also implies that the reason for Harrison's militancy during World War I was he was influenced by Du Bois's political warrior mentality during World War I. And as you will see as we go through these presentations, Harrison was the leading critic of Du Bois during World War I, when Du Bois advocated close ranks behind the war effort and sought a captaincy in military intelligence, that branch of the military which monitored the black and the African American community. Daedalus, leading publication of the Journal of the Academy of Arts and Science, was supposed to run a big featured article by me on Harrison and Allen. They pulled it after I spoke before Gates's audience. I think it's pretty clear Gates was involved, so there's some more of the details. When I started out writing the biography, publishing the biography, when I first looked up Harrison, Googled him, I found 755 results. Garvey had 1,380,000. That's over, what is that? That's over 1,000 times as many as Harrison. Du Bois had more than that, and Booker T had even more. So he's really been ignored for many, many years. All right, now we're going to go into Harrison's crucian roots, if you're with me. We'll go through crucian roots in his early years in New York, and then we'll stop and we'll do this discussion, if that's okay with people, unless you want to, because I just was giving an overview. Harrison, born in St. Croix, Danish West Indies. St. Croix has capitalist agriculture, colony of Denmark. When Harrison's born, only 475 people out of 23,000 could vote. It had some very identifiable African customs, including public gardens, etc., which Harrison comments on. The color line and social control was established in a very different manner than in the U.S. There was a policy of promotion, not proscription, of a sector of the African descended population. I will explain this in a sector. It had a rich history of direct action, mass struggle, and Harrison's family life was one which included involvement with the immigrant experience because his mom was from Barbados, his father had been born enslaved in St. Croix, and the estate where he was born and lived his early years, the state Concordia, had people from the Caribbean living there also. Here's the plantation where he was born. It was owned by two men of color. You wouldn't find that down south, right? Plantation owned by two men of color. Here's the village in 1869, shortly before he's born. This is when I went to visit in 2008, and it hadn't improved very much in all those years. Had a rich history of direct action mass struggle, Budo was the emancipation leader in 1848, second enslaved-led emancipation victory after Haiti in the Americas. They had major struggles in 1878, 79. One of the leaders was Queen Mary Thomas, the leader of the 1878 struggle. I worked in the post office with her great-grandson, Richard Thomas. Great Fire was the big, they burned a lot of the plantations in 1879, in 1878. It was followed by a general strike in 1879. Harrison then moved to the water gut section of Christiansted. Water gut, water gutter. It's where all the dirty water flew, into the, from the mountains on down into the sea. And he lived there, and this is what conditions were like in the water gut section. And, but he would go, even as a youth. He didn't have much opportunity to go to school. He did get some schooling up to 8th grade, but he'd go to St. John's Episcopal Church, and he'd go in there and was granted permission to use the library in this church. The church is still there, standing. And when I went on one of my visits to St. Croix, I went in, and they still have that room with some of the old books, in the library, kind of inspiring. Harrison commented on living in poverty. He wrote, "I have often thought that this contact with the stern realities of poverty was good for me. It has kept my heart open to the call of those who are down, and has kept me from giving myself such airs as might make a chasm between myself and my people." He always wanted to be in close touch and ties with his people. This is Concordia Ridge, the plantation where he lived. And this is where I took a little literary liberty, and I envisioned Harrison walking up that Concordia Ridge sometimes and looking down on Christiansted. That's Christiansted Harbor there, that's the capital. And looking out as far as the eye could see. And it brought back Longfellow, who wrote, where is it? I think it's the next quote. "The long, long thoughts," is drawn from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. "A boy's will is a wind's will, and the thoughts of youth are long, long thoughts." Harrison could dream while he was on that mountaintop. He was close friends with D. Hamilton Jackson, who became the leading labor educator in St. Croix, classmates. Here's what's very important about St. Croix in comparison with the U.S. The color line was drawn differently, and you have a similar pattern in Jamaica and in Barbados. In St. Croix, there was a policy of promotion, not strict proscription, for a significant sector of the African-descended population. There was no formal segregation, no history of lynch terror, and white supremacy was not as virulent or as organized as in the U.S. Reasons have to do with the following. In St. Croix, 5% of the population was European. 80% of the population was black. 15% of the population was of mixed European and African ancestry. The greatly outnumbered European ruling elite, for social control reasons, implemented a policy of promotion of a sector of the African-descended population. And this question of social control is key in what I'm going to say now, and it's crucial in Allen's work on the invention of the white race. So in St. Croix, during slavery, there was a policy of promotion and landholding for a sector of the African-descended population. Free colors served in the militia. And in 1834, free colors were extended an edict of free equality, at least nominally. Contrast that with the U.S., where the policy was severe racial prescriptions for all African Americans. Slave patrols were lily white, and Negroes, quote, as codified in the Dred Scott decision, had no rights that whites were bound to respect. Moving on. Harrison's mother died in 1899, and the death affected him deeply. He wrote about it in his diary, and he comes to New York in 1900 as an orphan. He follows an older sister who had come, and that's often the case with many of these Afro-Caribbean first-generation people. It's oftentimes a woman who's the first one who comes, an elder sister or something like that, paves the way for others. And she was living in the area in the West 60s, which was a major concentration of African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans. This is before the IRT subway gets built in 1964. And so Harrison lives with her, and he comes shortly after New York City suffers its fourth great race riot. It was said a black man couldn't walk between 42nd Street and 59th Street without fear of being attacked by a mob. This was totally unknown to Harrison. He didn't know this. This is actually the tenement on the next street where Harrison lived in the West 60s were described as the meanest tenements in New York. A decade later, they built these tenements, and these were improved. And the improvement in these tenements are that if you had an inside apartment, you could get a window into the courtyard, so you get some fresh air. But this is what the conditions were like in the West 60s. The year that Harrison arrived, 107 African American. Okay, what time is it now? Okay, maybe I'll go to end in a little bit. We're good? Let me go. 107 African Americans were lynched, and 4 were lynched at one time in 1900. Here's a photo of those 4. Now, Claude McKay came to New York shortly after Harrison came from Jamaica. He said when he came to the U.S., it's the first time I had ever come face to face with such manifest, implacable hatred of my race, and my feelings were indescribable. I'd heard of prejudice in America, but I never dreamed of it being so intensely bitter. Harrison writes, during the Danish days, there were no superior and inferior people on the island, but no instance were they made so by the color of their skin. If the lines of social and economic cleavage had at any time followed those of chromatics, I knew of no such thing. Marcus Garvey wrote, Jamaica is unlike the United States where the race question is concerned. We have no open race prejudice here. This is Garvey writing in the early 20th century. And we do not openly antagonize one another. The extremes here are not between white and black. Hence, we have never had a case of lynching or anything so desperate. All right, I'm going to get on with Harrison's life in New York, but maybe I'm going to take a break now because that was suggested. And we'll see if people have any questions, and maybe I'll sit down for a second, if that's okay. And I'll have a sip of water, and then we can pick it up again. But are there any questions at this point? I'm getting old, and I got some serious health issues, so I feel a little weak. No, I'm going to sit. I guess you could tell my voice was wobbly, and my standing was wobbly. But we're going to do this over a few weeks. Okay. Yes.
My name is Charles Jarvis. Thank you for your presentation.
So far.
I was born in West Indies myself. I was born in, did you get a chance to actually be able to see? We're recording, so. All right, thank you. Again.
Where in the West Indies, may I ask? I'm curious.
I was born in Antigua, so.
Yeah, well, hey, that comes into this story, too, you'll find, when you read Volume 1.
Well, it was intriguing because you talk about Watergut, and Watergut is a place that is really familiar to me in Antigua myself. But one of the things I just want to ask, because of the fact that Harrison was born in St. Croix. Now, at that time, St. Croix was under the Danish rule.
Right.
It was not an American. So I have two questions. Were you able to at least be able to determine that he was actually born in St. Croix? And how did he become an American citizen from being in St. Croix and being a part of the Danish? And why is it that radical, he's radical race? I mean, he was an intellectual. There's another thing that you talk about, the fact that he was black, he was from the Caribbean, he was poor, and this man gave and wrote so much into history, and he's almost like wiped away from the consciousness. And lastly, what was his relationship with Booker T. Washington, T. Montgomery, people like Booker T. Washington, T. Montgomery, and W.E.B. Du Bois? Thank you.
Well, we're going to get into all of these questions in the upcoming sessions, all of them in depth, but I want to start with he's born in St. Croix. It's Danish. In answer to your question, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I was able to get his baptism record. You know, I think I have a birth certificate too. It was filed a month or two after the baptism, or vice versa. But I have them. I placed them with Columbia. They're online. You can see them. His father, his biological father was not listed, and I think, you know, he was a biological father, but his biological mother married a man some years later, right? So he's in Denmark, but most of the he's in Denmark, and Denmark didn't become a possession of the U.S. until 1917, and it was acquired. And when Harrison tries to put in for citizenship, because all these years when he's writing, he's not a citizen of the U.S. And as a matter of fact, he is described by some of the historians, and I go into this in some detail, these Crucians in this period, even when he's putting in for citizens, he's a citizen in, but not of, the U.S. They couldn't vote, but then at points they wanted to draft him, and at other points they didn't. You know, it was a big mess. He finally got his citizenship in 1922. 1922, after putting in 1915, it took 7 years back then. But what's interesting about when he gets his citizenship, and J.A. Rogers comments on this in one of his books, when he gets his citizenship, on the citizenship papers, he's listed as white. And J.A. Rogers comments, because if you look at the front picture of the Hubert Harrison reader, he's very dark-skinned, right? And it was almost inconceivable to the authorities to be granting citizenship to a black Crucian in that period. But on this other stuff you're talking about, we are going to get into it in depth if we can get you back here once or twice more, you know, because it's a long story for Harrison, and I want to talk about it in depth and share it with you, because as you can see, I'm getting a little old, but I want this younger generation to pick it up and carry it forward and share it with others, you know. But if you want me to get into it now, but we might wait a little. See, is that okay? We pick it up in later. Yes. Okay. Any other questions?
How did you get interested?
Question is, can you hear me? How did I get interested in Harrison? Thank you. Excellent question. I think Rob has asked it before in some of these other sessions. I'm a product of the 60s. My family, born in the Bronx, working class all the way through. Nobody went to college. I have no proof that anybody ever finished high high school. I did get to go to colleges, and along the way, picked up some degrees. But I'm a product of the 60s, and I started getting involved in the late 60s. Did work with the Panthers, the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, with the Asian movement, with the labor movement. Was involved with everything. But at a certain point, around 73, 74, I decided that I really should get involved in the labor movement, because I was by that time pretty convinced. I had come under the influence around 69, 70 of Theodore W. Allen, who we'll talk about more in some of these sessions. Allen pioneered a class struggle-based analysis of white skin privilege in the 1960s, way before all this stuff that came out later, and there's a lot of touchy-feely and all this and that. And he wrote The Invention of the White Race, how the white race gets set up. And Allen focused on the centrality of the struggle against white supremacy to social change. So all those things came together, and I decided to go into the workforce. I was living in Jersey City at the time, and I got hired at the Bulk Mail Center, 4,000 worker facility in Jersey City. Sean, my friend here, was working there, and he also knew Ted Allen. And I wound up doing 33 years in the post office. Rank and file, activist, get fired in a strike, as did Sean. But I also became an officer. I edited papers at every level, rank and file, local, national, hassled all the way, fired, got my job back, this and that. And but then what happens, I'm going to graduate school while I'm doing this in American history. And I'm trying to, because I'm interested in radical politics, I want to look at all the left groups and how they had approached the question of white supremacy and where they had fallen by the wayside, what mistakes they had made, why they hadn't struggled against it more. So I got very familiar with the US left and what they did have to say about the race question and national, whatever they called it. And in the course of that research, and I stopped everything I was doing because Harrison was the clearest thinker I had come across on these questions of race and class. And some of the things I'm going to tell you, maybe if we go on tonight, if we got time, but if not, next week, on Harrison talking about the centrality of the struggle against white supremacy. Matter of fact, I'm going to give you a touch of what's coming, but this here, I brought it, so I might as well do this one at least. People are not familiar with what this is.
Jeff, I'm sorry. Can you please keep it brief because the library is closing at 8?
Okay, yeah, real brief.
We must respect the...
Okay, just the last thing. I'm going to go brief. This is a touchstone. It's a black stone. And Harrison writes one very important passage where he says, politically, the Negro is the touchstone of the modern democratic idea. And by that he means, I believe, take any issue, housing, unemployment, education, and you put it to the test. How is the Negro faring, and what are we going to do about it? And he understood that's the centrality of efforts at social change. So again, getting back to your question, I got clear on Harrison, and I started writing on his dissertation in his life. It was almost 40 years ago. And I was really undaunted once I got going because the family trusted me with his papers. I felt a great responsibility. Sorry. We have a few minutes left, and I guess we got to tidy up and clean up. But any more questions? That's okay, Rob, for today?
Yes. I want everyone to join me in thanking Dr. Perry for speaking.
Thank you. Thank you.
For further discussion about his life, and I urge everyone to stay alert for further announcements. I do want to thank the library staff for all of the effort that they put into this affair. And as a closing treat, they have provided grab-and-go items, including sandwiches, snacks, and other things that you can get by the door. So,
One more thing, Rob, just if I may. My webpage has all kinds of free things. JeffreyBPerry.net, audio, video, articles by and about Harrison. Please take advantage of it. We've got some free leaflets and flyers describing who he was, and the books are here if anybody's interested. But thanks, Rob. And I'll try and be stronger next time. Yeah. No, I got this cancer from 9/11. You know, I was working.